At the dawn of World War II, the German Wehrmacht rolled across Europe with precision-engineered machines, Panzer tanks, half-tracks, and the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, all designed to showcase German mechanical superiority. Their armies moved with clockwork efficiency, and their officers scoffed at anything that didn't fit their ideal of technological perfection. Then came the American Jeep. When German soldiers first laid eyes on the squat, boxy, open-top vehicle, they laughed. It looked crude, even comical, a toy compared to the sleek Kübelwagen. Wehrmacht officers joked that the Americans must have built it in a barn. They called it primitive, ugly, even a farmer's cart. But what they didn't realize, not yet, was that this simple, rugged little machine would become one of the most powerful symbols of Allied power. The Jeep was born out of desperation and speed. In 1940, the U.S. Army needed a light reconnaissance vehicle, capable of going anywhere, carrying men, radios, and supplies over terrain where no car could survive. In just 49 days, the first prototype was built. Within months, the Willys MB and Ford GPW Jeeps were rolling off production lines by the hundreds. What the Germans didn't see was that behind this humble frame was a masterpiece of design simplicity, a vehicle that could be mass-produced, repaired with basic tools, and driven through mud, snow, and battlefields where even tanks stalled. By 1942, the Jeep was everywhere. Across the deserts of North Africa, the muddy fields of France, the jungles of Burma, its presence became as common as the helmet or the rifle. German intelligence reports described the Americans as astonishingly mobile. They couldn't understand how U.S. forces seemed to appear in impossible places, how convoys reached remote outposts, or how small patrols could strike and vanish again. The answer, more often than not, was the Jeep. In the Tunisia campaign, German officers began to notice something unsettling. These inferior vehicles kept moving long after the Kübelwagens had broken down. In the searing desert heat, where the dust clogged engines and shredded tires, the Jeep kept running. It wasn't fast, it wasn't fancy, but it didn't quit. The same could not always be said for German engineering, which, though brilliant, was too delicate, too complicated for the chaos of war. As the Allies pushed into North Africa, German troops began doing something no one would have predicted 2 years earlier. They started capturing Jeeps. And they didn't just use them, they prized them. Reports from captured Wehrmacht soldiers described the Jeep as one of the most useful vehicles on the battlefield. German generals began ordering their men to recover intact Jeeps whenever possible. In fact, the German army began to quietly admire what they once mocked. One officer, interrogated after the war, admitted, "We called it a joke, until we realized it was the best motor vehicle ever made for war." In the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, it wasn't uncommon to see German troops driving captured Jeeps, the white crosses painted over with black Bokenkreuz, trying to disguise them as their own. By 1943, the shift in attitude was undeniable. The once proud Kübelwagen, Germany's own light transport, had proven underpowered and underbuilt for harsh combat zones. Designed for European roads, it struggled in mud and steep terrain. Meanwhile, the Jeep climbed hills, forded rivers, carried mortars, towed artillery, and evacuated the wounded. It became the Swiss Army knife of vehicles. But the real shock came not just from what the Jeep could do. It came from how many the Americans could make. While Germany produced just over 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire war, the United States manufactured over 639,000 Jeeps. The scale was staggering, a reflection of America's unmatched industrial capacity. To the Germans, this wasn't just about machinery anymore. It was psychological. For the first time, they saw what total war meant when backed by industrial might. The Jeep became a rolling symbol of that might. It was proof that the Americans could outbuild, outrepair, and outlast anything the Reich could throw at them. A German officer later said, "When we saw the endless Jeeps, we knew we could not win. You cannot fight a factory." By the time of the Allied invasion of Italy, captured Jeeps were so highly valued that orders were issued to secure them at all costs. Panzer Grenadier units used them for scouting, transporting ammunition, even impersonating Allied patrols. The irony was profound. The same vehicle once ridiculed as a joke had become one of the most coveted assets in the German war machine. And perhaps nowhere was this transformation clearer than during the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, as Hitler launched his last great offensive in the Ardennes, a special unit under SS Kommando Otto Skorzeny prepared for a daring deception mission, Operation Greif. Their objective: infiltrate American lines using English-speaking Germans dressed in U.S. uniforms. For this, Skorzeny's men needed jeeps, not Kübelwagens, not motorcycles, but American jeeps. They scoured captured depots and battlefields, gathering every jeep they could find. It was a chilling acknowledgement. The German army, once the paragon of mechanical excellence, now relied on American engineering to carry out one of its most audacious missions. From 1941 to 1945, the Jeep had gone from laughter to legend. It wasn't sleek, but it was unstoppable. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was perfect. In a war of machinery, it was the machine that mattered most. Not because it was the most advanced, but because it worked every time, everywhere. And that, more than its steel frame or four-wheel drive, was its true genius. As the war dragged into its middle years, 1943 and 1944, the laughter that had once followed the sight of an American Jeep turned into an uneasy respect across the German front lines. In North Africa, captured American soldiers sometimes heard their captors talk about the little devil car that seemed to appear out of nowhere. By then, the Jeep was not just transport, it was strategy on wheels. It carried generals like Eisenhower and Patton across battlefields, it hauled ammunition and medics through shellfire, and it brought reconnaissance patrols deep into enemy territory where no other vehicle could go. German engineers studied the Jeeps they captured. They stripped them down, measured their parts, and tried to understand why something that looked so simple was so effective. The answer frustrated them. The Jeep was not beautiful, but it was practical. It was light enough to be pushed by its own crew if stuck in mud, sturdy enough to take direct fire on its steel grille, and small enough to be loaded into a plane or onto a ship. It could be dropped by parachute, driven onto a landing craft, or lashed to the deck of a destroyer. It was not designed to impress, it was designed to win. In Italy, the Jeep's reputation spread among Allied and Axis troops alike. It climbed the rocky hills of Monte Cassino, crossed flooded rivers, and followed mule paths that no truck could attempt. German mountain troops who captured one often refused to give it back, using it to haul equipment or wounded men. The Kübelwagen, their own counterpart, lacked the same power and grip. Its rear-wheel drive failed where the Jeep's four-wheel drive triumphed. Wehrmacht drivers soon knew that if they found a Jeep, they had found gold. To the American soldier, the Jeep became more than a vehicle. It was a companion. Men gave them nicknames, painted names and pin-up art on their hoods, and trusted them as much as they trusted their rifles. For soldiers who had marched through mud and ice, the Jeep meant movement, survival, freedom. It could carry the wounded to safety or rush ammunition to a dying front line. In the frozen hell of the Ardennes, it carried hot coffee, blankets, and hope. German prisoners later recalled how surreal it was to see the endless streams of Jeeps after being captured. They were everywhere, one officer said. Like ants, you kill one, and 10 more appear. For the Germans, it was a visible, moving reminder of industrial defeat. Behind every Jeep was a factory. Behind every factory, a nation that could produce not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands. America's arsenal of democracy didn't just make tanks and planes, it made mobility. By late 1944, even the highest German command acknowledged that their own designs had failed to meet the demands of total war. Hitler's obsession with complex, over-engineered weapons, the Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, had drained resources, while the Allies perfected simplicity and scale. The Jeep became a quiet but perfect expression of that difference. Simple, cheap, reliable, and everywhere at once. As the Allies liberated France, Jeeps rolled through towns ahead of the columns. Crowds cheered not just the soldiers, but the sight of those little vehicles bouncing over rubble, carrying the flags of liberation. They had become icons of freedom. And still, among retreating German troops, there was envy, a grudging admiration for what they now called the miracle car. By the war's end, captured Jeeps could be found in every corner of the crumbling Reich. From Norway's fjords to the streets of Berlin, German units painted over stars with crosses, using them until the very end. Even the Waffen-SS used Jeeps during the last desperate battles. They had stopped laughing long ago. When the shooting finally stopped and the world counted its losses, the Jeep remained, scattered across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Farmers bought them, resistance fighters kept them, and civilians drove them through the ruins. The Germans had once prided themselves on engineering perfection. The Americans had built something far more valuable, engineering that endured. In the years that followed, as nations rebuilt, the Jeep became a symbol of everything that had defined the Allied victory: practicality, perseverance, and relentless production. What had begun as a tool of war turned into a cornerstone of peace. Soldiers took them home, factories turned their blueprints into civilian models, and the world that once mocked them now bought them. For German veterans, seeing Jeeps still rolling years after the war was a humbling memory. Many recalled how they had once joked about those ridiculous American toys. Now, they knew better. The Jeep had outlasted the Reich, the war, and even the myths of superiority that had started it all. The little machine that had once made them laugh had carried entire armies to victory, and, in the end, became one of the most captured, most respected, and most unforgettable vehicles of the Second World War. When peace finally came in 1945, the world looked very different, and so did the reputation of the American Jeep. What had started as a wartime necessity became an enduring symbol of resilience, practicality, and freedom. The same little vehicle that had charged through the mud of Normandy and the deserts of North Africa was now rolling down the streets of Europe, not as a weapon, but as a liberator. In bombed-out German cities, civilians used captured Jeeps to haul debris and rebuild homes. In France and the Netherlands, resistance fighters who had relied on smuggled Jeeps during the war now used them to rebuild farms and transport goods. Across Asia, Allied occupation forces kept their Jeeps running long after the last shots were fired. The machine was simple enough that local mechanics could repair it with whatever tools they had, a testament to the genius of its design. Even German engineers, once proud of their complex machines, quietly studied the Jeep in the post-war years. They learned something humbling. In total war, perfection was not the goal, efficiency was. The Jeep's small four-cylinder engine, its stamped steel body, and its leaf-spring suspension weren't revolutionary, but together they formed a masterpiece of purpose-built simplicity. It could be produced in massive numbers, fixed easily in the field, and adapted for any terrain. In the factories of Wolfsburg, where the Volkswagen Beetle would soon become the face of post-war Germany, engineers borrowed from what they had learned from the Jeep. The philosophy of form follows function became central to their designs, a quiet echo of what they had once fought against. Meanwhile, in America, the Jeep found a new life. The war had made it famous. Peace made it beloved. Returning veterans wanted a piece of that freedom again. The feeling of adventure, the open road, the confidence that a small machine could take them anywhere. Willys Overland saw the opportunity and transformed the rugged MB into the civilian CJ, or civilian Jeep. The first models rolled off assembly lines in 1945, and they were almost identical to the vehicles that had crossed Europe and the Pacific. Farmers bought them to plow fields. Hunters used them to reach the backcountry. Families took them up mountains and through rivers. The same vehicle that had carried soldiers through gunfire now carried children and supplies. The Jeep had transcended war. It had become part of life itself. And yet, even as the world moved on, the stories of captured German Jeeps remained part of military folklore. In memoirs, Wehrmacht and SS veterans often wrote with a mixture of admiration and irony. "When we captured a Jeep," one recalled, "we guarded it more carefully than our officers." Another admitted that, if we had built something like it, we might have lasted longer. But perhaps the most telling quote came from a German general during an interrogation in 1945. When asked what he thought had won the war for the Allies, he didn't mention tanks, aircraft, or atomic bombs. He paused, then said, "The Jeep, because it never stopped coming." Indeed, the Jeep was more than steel and rubber. It represented something deeply human: adaptability, cooperation, and endurance. Its very design was a product of collaboration: Ford, Willys, and the U.S. Army working together to solve a problem quickly and efficiently. In that sense, it embodied the spirit of democracy itself, a collective effort that defeated tyranny. As the Cold War dawned, the Jeep once again found itself in the center of global events. American troops drove them through the ruins of Korea, across the jungles of Vietnam, and into the deserts of the Middle East. Wherever freedom needed defending, the Jeep was there, its DNA carried forward in every Humvee, Land Rover, and modern 4x4 that followed. Back in Germany, captured wartime Jeeps continued to run for years, long after the factories that built them had retooled for peace. Mechanics in small villages kept them running with improvised parts, sometimes welding bits of Kübelwagens or tractors just to keep them alive. They became symbols of survival, machines that had outlived the war that created them. By the 1960s, the Jeep was recognized worldwide as more than a military vehicle. It was an icon of freedom. From movies to magazines, it represented independence and exploration. It was no longer the American Jeep. It was simply the Jeep, a universal word for mobility and strength. Even today, over 8 decades later, the legacy of that once mocked machine still echoes through history. Every time a Jeep engine starts, it carries the memory of those first soldiers who drove it through the dust and fire of World War II, and of the enemies who once laughed at it, only to end up chasing after it. In the end, the Jeep didn't just help win a war. It proved a point, that true power lies not in complexity, but in simplicity done perfectly. It showed that strength is not in how loud you roar, but how far you can go, again and again, without ever stopping. And as the last surviving veterans look back on those days, one truth remains clear. The little vehicle that Germany once ridiculed became one of the greatest symbols of victory and freedom the world has ever known. In the aftermath of World War II, the Jeep's legend grew beyond battlefields. It became a symbol of the unstoppable Allied spirit. Its unmistakable silhouette, flat hood, 7-slot grille, round headlights, became a global icon of liberation. Soldiers who once huddled in its open cabin through rain, snow, and fire remembered it not as a machine, but as a companion that never failed them. Many veterans swore the Jeep had a soul, that it somehow understood when to push through mud, when to climb one more hill, when to get them home. As Europe rebuilt, the Jeep continued to serve. The Marshall Plan brought thousands of Jeeps to countries devastated by war. They hauled lumber in Norway, delivered mail in France, patrolled borders in Greece, and carried doctors to remote villages in Italy. To millions of Europeans, the Jeep was the first vehicle they saw after liberation, the face of America, not as conqueror, but as helper. In Germany, too, the sight of the Jeep became familiar. Ironically, the same soldiers who had once called it a toy truck were now being transported in its back seats as prisoners or workers rebuilding bombed cities. Many admitted a grudging admiration. It was unstoppable, one Wehrmacht mechanic recalled. You could throw it off a bridge, drag it out of a river, dry it in the sun, and it would start again. But while the Jeep conquered hearts in Europe, across the Pacific its story was no less remarkable. On the islands of Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines, Jeeps crawled over coral reefs and volcanic ash. They carried wounded men, supplies, ammunition, and hope. In jungles so thick that tanks couldn't move, the Jeep became the soldier's best friend. The Japanese, who had initially dismissed it as crude, soon learned to fear its versatility. Captured Jeeps were repainted and pressed into service wherever possible, their American stars replaced with rising sun insignias. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces brought thousands more Jeeps to the archipelago. They became a common sight on the streets of Tokyo, weaving between the rubble and neon signs of a new era. For many Japanese citizens, the Jeep symbolized the strange mix of defeat and rebirth, the machine that came with war and stayed for peace. Meanwhile, in the United States, returning soldiers couldn't forget what the Jeep had meant to them. When Willys began advertising the civilian CJ, civilian Jeep, their slogan, "The Jeep goes to work," resonated deeply. For men who had seen it ford rivers, climb mountains, and cross minefields, there was no better proof of reliability. Soon, farms across America echoed with the sound of Jeep engines. Farmers replaced tractors with CJs that could plow, haul, and even power machinery through a belt-driven PTO system. It wasn't just farmers. Explorers, surveyors, forest rangers, and construction workers all embraced the Jeep. The same features that made it ideal for war, lightweight, simple mechanics, rugged suspension, made it perfect for the American frontier. Suddenly, adventure was not just a dream, it was a drive away. Hollywood took notice, too. Post-war films showed heroes driving jeeps through exotic landscapes, adding to the aura of freedom. In 1953, the Korean War brought the Jeep back to combat. Still the same basic design, still unstoppable. And once again, soldiers on both sides respected it. Reports from captured North Korean officers mentioned the Jeep as the enemy's most agile weapon. Back in Germany, the echoes of that respect still lingered. In military museums and veterans' reunions, former Wehrmacht officers would sometimes smile when shown photos of Jeeps. They'd say, "We used to steal those whenever we could." What began as mockery in 1941 had ended as admiration in 1945, a perfect circle of irony. But beneath the nostalgia was a deeper truth. The Jeep represented something the German war machine could never achieve. It was mass production with soul, engineering that worked because it didn't overthink itself. While German vehicles like the Tiger tank and Kübelwagen required specialized parts and careful maintenance, the Jeep could be fixed with a wrench and a piece of wire. It wasn't delicate, it was determined. That simplicity became its legacy. Even as technology advanced, armies around the world copied its principles: small, light, versatile, and easy to maintain. British Land Rovers, Russian GAZ-69s, and even Japanese Toyota Land Cruisers all owed their existence to the Jeep's blueprint. And yet, the original still had a magic no copy could match. To drive one was to feel a connection to history, to imagine the soldiers who once gripped its steering wheel on frozen roads or desert dunes. Every scratch in its steel body seemed to tell a story, a battle fought, a life saved, a moment of courage. In the ruins of Europe, some captured Jeeps were buried under debris, only to be rediscovered decades later, rusted but intact. When restored, they still started, as if the little vehicle refused to die, even after 80 years. Because the Jeep wasn't just a machine. It was a statement, a reminder that strength isn't about luxury or power, but about perseverance. The Germans, who once laughed at it, learned that lesson the hard way. The Jeep proved that in the end, it's not the most complicated weapon that wins a war. It's the one that keeps going, no matter what. In the years that followed World War II, the Jeep transcended its military origins to become a symbol of endurance, freedom, and ingenuity recognized around the world. It rolled from the muddy trenches of Europe into the peacetime highways of America and the dirt roads of distant continents. What had started as a tool of war evolved into an emblem of human perseverance, a machine that didn't just carry soldiers, but carried nations through recovery, rebuilding, and rediscovery. As reconstruction began across the shattered cities of Europe, thousands of surplus Jeeps were sold or repurposed to help farmers, builders, and civilians reclaim their lives. In France, a single Jeep might tow wagons, plow fields, and deliver supplies across terrain still scarred by shell holes. In Italy, priests used them to reach mountain villages. In Greece, doctors and Red Cross workers drove them through ruins to bring medicine and food. These were not military missions anymore. They were acts of survival, made possible by a vehicle designed for war but reborn for peace. The image of a Jeep weaving through rubble with a white star still painted on its hood became a metaphor for the world's determination to move forward. Its design, compact, angular, resilient, mirrored the mindset of an age rebuilding from ashes. People trusted it because it represented something rare: reliability in chaos. The Jeep's influence spread rapidly beyond Europe. In Asia, Africa, and South America, American surplus Jeeps found new homes in rugged landscapes where few vehicles dared to go. They became safari trucks, field ambulances, mountain taxis, and exploration rigs. Wherever roads were bad or non-existent, the Jeep made one. In jungles, deserts, and frozen plains, it was the first sign that humanity was reaching out again, expanding, connecting, surviving. Back in America, the Jeep's post-war transformation was nothing short of cultural. Willys Overland saw the potential immediately and marketed the first civilian version, the CJ2A, as a go-anywhere, do-anything machine for the working man. For veterans returning home, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a piece of their past, a trusted friend reborn in peacetime colors. They recognized the sound of its engine, the feel of its steering wheel, and the spirit that had once carried them through hell. By the 1950s, the Jeep had become synonymous with adventure. Magazines featured explorers driving them across the Himalayas or through the Amazon. Television shows used them as props of rugged independence. In popular culture, the Jeep represented an ideal, not of war, but of freedom. It wasn't glamorous or fast, but it was honest and unstoppable, much like the soldiers who had driven it into history. For the Germans, that same little vehicle had left an indelible mark. In the post-war Bundeswehr, American-made Jeeps and their licensed successors became standard vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered the war. The machine once mocked as inferior had become a symbol of modern mobility, even for their former adversaries. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Jeep lies in what it symbolized beyond technology: the triumph of simplicity and spirit over arrogance and complexity. During the war, German engineering had prided itself on precision, on perfection, but the Jeep's rough edges and unassuming design embodied something the Axis powers could never replicate: adaptability. It didn't just survive adversity, it thrived in it. Even decades later, the Jeep's story continued to echo. In the Korean War, Vietnam, and countless peacekeeping missions, it carried soldiers once again. Different uniforms, same determination. In museums around the world today, restored Jeeps stand beside tanks and planes far larger and more intimidating, yet none of them carry the same emotional power. Because the Jeep wasn't about domination, it was about endurance. Every dent, every worn tire, every faded number tells a human story. A medic rushing through mud under fire, a radio operator carrying wounded men to safety, a commander leading his troops over a frozen hill. The Jeep was there through it all, silent, loyal, unyielding. And perhaps that's why, even now, it remains one of the most recognizable and respected symbols of World War II. The Germans learned too late that the power of the Jeep wasn't in its steel or its engine, but in what it represented: the unstoppable will of a people determined to overcome. So when history remembers the mighty tanks, the battleships, and the aircraft that defined the Second World War, it must also remember the little vehicle that connected them all: the humble Jeep. Because while others were designed to destroy, the Jeep was built to endure. And in the end, endurance is what wins wars. As the dust of war settled and nations rebuilt from the ruins, the Jeep stood as a lasting reminder of ingenuity forged under pressure. It had been born from necessity, shaped by innovation, and proven by war. In every corner of the world, from the shattered villages of France to the frozen fields of Eastern Europe, Jeeps were left behind like silent witnesses, tools that had carried soldiers through chaos and now carried civilians toward peace. The men who once drove them in battle often found themselves behind the same steering wheels years later, this time wearing work clothes instead of uniforms. They remembered the nights when the engine's hum was their only companion, when a Jeep's silhouette in the moonlight meant hope, a way out, a lifeline, a chance to keep moving. For them, the war had ended, but the Jeep's spirit never died. Its design remained timeless because it was honest. There was no luxury, no excess, just purpose. Every bolt, every lever, every flat panel served a function. It wasn't a car meant for comfort. It was meant to go wherever it was needed. And that simple truth became its greatest strength. By the time the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the Jeep had evolved into a global phenomenon. Soldiers returning home became mechanics, explorers, farmers, and adventurers, and they brought the Jeep's legend with them. The rugged vehicle that once rolled into combat zones now climbed mountains, forded rivers, and crossed deserts. It symbolized something universal: the idea that no obstacle was too great when courage and determination were behind the wheel. Even nations that once fought against it came to embrace it. German engineers studied its construction, marveling at its ease of repair and adaptability. In post-war Europe, the Jeep was often the first vehicle to bring mail, food, and medicine to remote areas. It was as if the very machine once designed for war had become a messenger of recovery. The Jeep's spirit carried into generations that never saw the war. Children grew up watching movies where heroes drove them across enemy lines or into the wilderness. The word Jeep itself became more than a brand. It became a synonym for resilience. To say something was as tough as a Jeep meant it could survive anything. Its military descendants, like the M38 and later the M151 Mutt, continued to serve armies around the world, while civilian models carried explorers to the edges of civilization. Each model, though updated, carried the DNA of that first Willys MB, compact, capable, unbreakable. But beyond the steel and the wheels, the Jeep carried memories of soldiers who didn't return, of friendships formed under fire, of victories earned through grit, not glory. Veterans could look at one decades later and feel a rush of emotion, not for the battles they fought, but for the moments of humanity the Jeep had given them. A ride for a wounded friend, a brief rest in the rain, a quiet cigarette shared on a muddy hood before the next push forward. Those moments, more than the battles or the medals, are what gave the Jeep its immortality. It was never just a vehicle. It was a bridge between man and machine, between war and survival, between despair and hope. When historians write about the great machines of World War II, they often mention the Sherman tank, the B-17 Flying Fortress, or the Higgins landing craft, all marvels of engineering and production. But ask the soldiers who lived it, and they'll tell you, the Jeep was the one they trusted most. It was their constant companion, their lifeline, their symbol of persistence. Today, more than 80 years later, countless Jeeps still run, restored, rebuilt, and revered by collectors and enthusiasts who understand their place in history. Some sit in museums, their paint faded but their spirit intact. Others are driven daily, their engines still echoing the rhythm of an era when the world fought for its freedom. The Germans, who once mocked it, ended up respecting it. The Allies, who relied on it, never forgot it. And the world, which witnessed it, still admires it. Because in every sense, the Jeep wasn't just a machine built to fight a war. It was a machine that helped win one. And long after the last battle ended, its story continued, not in the roar of engines or the clash of steel, but in the quiet hum of a small vehicle that refused to quit. In the fading echoes of World War II, as the smoke lifted and the battlefields fell silent, a new sound began to emerge, the quiet hum of engines rolling toward peace. Among the ruins and the rebuilding, one machine continued its journey long after the guns went silent, the American Jeep. It had started as nothing more than a sketch, a 49-day miracle of engineering born out of desperation. No one could have predicted that this small, boxy vehicle, built to carry 2 soldiers and a machine gun, would become the mechanical symbol of freedom. The Jeep wasn't fast, it wasn't armored, and it wasn't beautiful, but it was unstoppable. It became a moving testament to what American industry, ingenuity, and determination could achieve. When the Germans first saw it, they laughed. They called it a toy, a peasant's cart, a machine fit only for farm work. But laughter turned to silence on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. They watched as Jeeps climbed dunes that even tanks struggled with, sped through shellfire carrying wounded soldiers, and slipped behind enemy lines as silent ghosts of reconnaissance. What they once mocked became the prize every soldier wanted to capture. By 1945, the irony was complete. German troops scavenged battlefields not for weapons, but for Jeeps. They repainted them, disguised them, and depended on them. Even the elite commandos of Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif, tasked with sowing chaos during the Battle of the Bulge, requested American Jeeps to infiltrate Allied lines. It was the ultimate sign of respect. The enemy had adopted what they could not match. But the Jeep was more than just a tool of war. It was a companion. It carried generals to victory speeches, medics to dying men, supplies to starving civilians. It was there when the Allies liberated Paris, when they crossed the Rhine, and when they rolled through the gates of concentration camps. It bore witness to both the triumph and the tragedy of human history. When the war ended, the Jeep didn't retire, it transformed. It became the vehicle of a new era. Farmers used it to plow fields once scarred by bombs. Adventurers drove it into jungles and deserts that had never seen a road. Nations rebuilt, and the same vehicle that carried soldiers to battle now carried doctors, teachers, and families into the future. The war had ended, but the Jeep's mission had not. Even today, when we see a Jeep, old or new, we see more than metal. We see courage. We see invention. We see the spirit of people who refuse to give up. Its simple design became a metaphor for resilience itself. It didn't need armor to be strong. It didn't need size to be powerful. It didn't need beauty to be unforgettable. In every turn of its wheel, you can still feel history moving. The sound of its engine carries the whispers of Normandy, the deserts of El Alamein, the forests of the Ardennes. It carries the laughter of soldiers, the cries of the wounded, the prayers of those who made it home, and those who didn't. The Germans once laughed at the Jeep. The world now honors it. Because in the end, the Jeep wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of freedom, of endurance, of the ordinary made extraordinary. It didn't just carry men through war. It carried humanity through its darkest hour. And in that, the Jeep earned something far greater than victory. It earned immortality.